Holding the world in kindness. A psychology of compassion. O nobly born, now there is born in you exceeding compassion for all those living creatures who have forgotten their true nature. Mahamudra text of Tibetan yogi Longchenpa. Overcome any bitterness because you were not up to the magnitude of the pain entrusted to you. Like the mother of the world who carries the pain of the world in her heart, you are sharing in the totality of this pain and are called upon to meet it in compassion and joy instead of self-pity. Sufi Master Pir Vilayat Khan. Alan Wallace, a leading Western teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, puts it like this. Imagine walking along a sidewalk with your arms full of groceries and someone roughly bumps into you so that you fall and your groceries are strewn over the ground. As you rise up from the puddle of broken eggs and tomato juice, you are ready to shout out, "You idiot! What's this wrong with you? Are you blind?" But just before you can catch your breath to speak, you see that the person who bumped into you is actually blind. He, too, is sprawled in the spilled groceries, and your anger vanishes in an instant, to be replaced by sympathetic concern. Are you hurt? Can I help you up? Our situation is like that. When we clearly realize that the source of disharmony and misery in the world is ignorance, we can open the door of wisdom and compassion. Each person who comes for spiritual teachings or psychotherapy carries in his or her measure of confusion and sorrow. Buddhism teaches that we suffer not because we have sinned, but because we are blind. Compassion is the natural response to this blindness. It arises whenever we see our human situation clearly. Buddhist texts describe compassion as the quivering of the heart in the face of pain, as the capacity to see our struggles with kindly eyes. We need compassion, not anger, to help us be tender with our difficulties and not close off to them in fear. This is how healing takes place. This is a second principle of Buddhist psychology. Compassion is our deepest nature. It arises from our interconnection with all things. When I first came to Buddhist practice as a monk, I wasn't conscious of how much pain I carried. I had managed to shut down the childhood memories of violence, the self-doubt and feelings of unworthiness, the struggle to be loved. In meditation and the monastery life, they all came up. The stored history, the judgments and buried pains. At first, the demanding schedule and practices increased my sense of struggle and unworthiness. I tried to force myself to be disciplined, to be better. Eventually, I discovered that unworthiness is not helped by striving. I learned that for real healing, I needed compassion. On one occasion, I was sick with what was probably malaria, lying in my hut, feverish and wretched. I had received medicine from a monastery elder, but it was slow in taking effect. Ayan Cha came to visit me. "Sick and feverish, huh?" he asked. "Yes," I replied weakly. "It's painful all over, isn't it?" I nodded. "Makes you feel sorry for yourself, doesn't it?" I smiled a bit. "Makes you want to go home to see your mother." He smiled and then nodded. "Yes, it's suffering, all right. Almost all the forest monks have had it. At least now we have a good medicine." He paused. "Here, this is where we have to practice, not just sitting in the meditation hall. It's hard. All the body torment and mind states. You learn a lot." He waited for a while, then he looked at me with the warmth of a kind grandfather. "You can bear it, you know? You can do it." And I felt that he was fully there with me, that he knew my pain from his own heart struggles. It took another day for the medicine to kick in, but his simple kindness made the situation bearable. His compassion gave me courage and helped me find my own freedom in the midst of hardship. Beneath the sophistication of Buddhist psychology lies the simplicity of compassion. We can touch into this compassion whenever the mind is quiet, whenever we allow the heart to open. Unfortunately, like the clay covering the golden Buddha, thick layers of ignorance and trauma can obscure our compassion. On the global scale, ignorance manifests as injustice, racism, exploitation, and violence. On a personal scale, we see our own states of envy, anxiety, addiction, and aggression. When we take this blindness to be the end of the story, we limit the possibility of human development. Consider Freud, whose revolutionary work brought so much understanding of the psyche. But in Civilization and its Discontents, he comes to a deeply pessimistic conclusion about the human heart. He states, civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts. The ideal's commandment to love one's neighbor as yourself, it really justified by the fact that nothing else runs so strongly counter to original human nature as this. Yes, we must recognize this aggressive aspect of our human nature. But in this essay, Freud stops there, completely missing the opposite and more powerful fact that our individual lives and our whole society are built upon innumerable acts of kindness. Compassion is our nature. From the perspective of Buddhist psychology, compassion is natural. It derives from our interconnection, which Buddhism calls interdependence. This can be readily seen in the physical world. In the womb, every child is interdependent with its mother's body. If either of them is sick, the other is affected. In the same way, we are interdependent with the body of the earth. The minerals of the soil make up our wheat and our bones. Wheat, 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 wheat. And our bones, the storm clouds, become our drinks. And our blood, 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 blood. The oxygen from the trees and forests is the air we breathe. The more consciously we realize this shared destiny, the more compassion arises for the earth itself. For the earth itself. The human community is equally interconnected. Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu puts it simply. In Africa, when you ask someone, "How are you?" the reply you get is in the plural even when you are speaking to one person. A man would say, "We are well," or "We are not well." He himself may be quite well, but his grandmother is not well, and so he is not well either. The solitary, isolated human being is really a contradiction in terms. Fortunately, we are becoming more and more aware of our global interconnection. Every meal we eat is intertwined with the sweat of farmers, migrant workers, and long-haul truckers. It depends on the global climate and the earthworms in our soil, centuries of experiments in crop rotation, and Gregor Mendel's scientific breakthroughs in seed selection. Its roots extend from the earliest agriculture in Mesopotamia and China to this morning's market rates at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Just as we are interdependent with the earth and one another, we are also connected in consciousness. Western psychology does not yet acknowledge this, but it is true. Years ago, when my wife and I were studying at an ashram in the mountains of India, my wife had a very clear but difficult vision of a death in her family. I tried to reassure her that images of death were simply a part of the meditative process. Sadly, I was wrong. 10 days later, we received a telegram that began, "Your brother Paul has died." When we read further, we discovered that the telegram was sent on the day of her vision, and that Paul had died on the day in exactly the manner she had seen. We have all heard stories like this. This is because we are connected in consciousness. This fact is the basis for compassion. There is a neurological basis for compassion as well. In the 1980s, Italian scientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues discovered a class of brain cells called mirror neurons. Extensive research since that time has shown that through our mirror neurons, we actually feel the emotions, movements, and intentions of others. Researchers describe this natural empathy as part of the social brain, a neural circuitry that connects us intimately in every human encounter. In Buddhist psychology, compassion is not a struggle or a sacrifice. Within our body, compassion is natural and intuitive. We don't think, oh, my poor toe or finger is hurt, maybe I should help it. As soon as it is injured, we instantly respond because it is part of us. Through meditation, we gradually open the boundaries of consciousness to compassion for all beings, as if they were part of our family. We learn that even when our compassion is lost through fear and trauma, it can be reawakened. Faced with a crying child in a burning house, a hardened criminal is as likely as anyone else to take the risk of rescuing her. We all have moments when the openness and beauty of our Buddha nature shines. D.S. Barnett, writing in the magazine The Sun, shows how compassion can bloom even in the midst of a terrible childhood. Mother always assured me that unspeakable punishments were bound to befall any child as naughty as I was. If I were you, she'd say, I'd be afraid to go to sleep at night, for fear God would strike me dead. She would speak these words softly, regretfully, as though saddened by her errant daughter's fate. After describing years of abuse and violation, Barnett goes on, the most devastating words my mother ever spoke to me came when I asked her if she loved me. I had just been escorted home by the police after one of my many attempts to run away, so it was bad timing on my part. She answered, how could anyone ever love you? It took me almost 50 years to heal the damage from all her ugly remarks. Then she relates a childhood ritual that helped her survive. From the age of 5 or 6 until I was well into my teens, whenever I had trouble sleeping, I would slip out from under my covers and steal into the kitchen for a bit of bread or cheese, which I would carry back to bed with me. There, I'd pretend my hands belonged to someone else, a comforting, reassuring being without a name, an angel, perhaps. The right hand would feed me little bites of cheese or bread as the left hand stroked my cheeks and hair. My eyes closed, I would whisper softly to myself, there, go to sleep. You're safe now. Everything will be all right. I love you. Describing the life-denying landscape of her childhood, Barnett shows how caring floods through us like an inner angel of mercy, like green shoots forcing their way through cracks in the sidewalk. We can see the natural hand of compassion in all the ways we try to keep ourselves from harm, in 1,000 daily gestures of self-protection. The problem of self-hatred. In 1989, at one of the first international Buddhist teacher meetings, we Western teachers brought up the enormous problem of unworthiness and self-criticism, shame and self-hatred, and how frequently they arose in Western students' practice. The Dalai Lama and other Asian teachers were shocked. They could not quite comprehend the word self-hatred. It took the Dalai Lama 10 minutes of conferring with Geshe Thupten Jinpa, his translator, even to understand it. Then he turned and asked how many of us experience this problem in ourselves and our students. He saw us all nod affirmatively. He seemed genuinely surprised. But that's a mistake, he said. Every being is precious. Nevertheless, self-judgment and shame were there in many of those who came to Buddhist practice. I certainly knew it in myself. In order to survive the periods of extreme conflict within my family, I covered over my pain. I became a peacemaker and a good boy. When my parents were battling, I tried to calm them down, without much success. When I went to school, I tried to stay safe by pleasing the teachers. Secretly, I envied the bad boys, the ones who skipped class, smoked behind the school, and got into fights. It looked like they were having more fun. Today, of course, I know that many of them were struggling too, acting cool to deal with their own fears. While trying to be good, underneath I had a feeling of being unloved, of forever seeking acceptance. In meditation and body oriented therapy, I got to know these feelings more fully. They came so often. I learned to put my hands on my belly and heart to hold the pain and emptiness. At times it felt like an insatiable hunger, and at times it left me feeling very young. I was a tiny infant whose parents were already fighting horribly. My mother tells me while I cried and cried. My twin brother and I, and my next brother, born a year later, were all allies in survival for most of our childhood, while my parents were triply overwhelmed. For me, the bottle I got on a schedule, it seems, was not enough. So inside I felt the hole in my belly and heart and the sense of being unlovable. I would curl up in a ball, and in the image that came, I felt like a starving Ethiopian child I had seen on television. I named this boy Ethi. Yes, he wanted food, but most of all, he wanted love. This was the food he was starved for, and through years of practice, I gradually learned to provide it. My sympathy for Ethi has strongly inspired me to support organizations that feed hungry children. Each of us has our own measure of pain. Sometimes the pain we suffer is great and obvious, sometimes it is subtle. Our pain can reflect the coldness of our families, the trauma of our parents, the stultifying influence of much modern education and media, the difficulties of being a man or a woman. As a result, we often feel that we have been cast out. To survive, we have to cover our heart, build up a layer of clay, and defend ourselves. We lose the belief that we are worthy of love. The mystic Simone Weil tells us, the danger is not that the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but that, by a lie, it should persuade itself that it is not hungry. Compassion reminds us that we do belong as surely as we have been lost. As you read this book, at times Buddhist psychology may appear dry, full of lists and practices. Always remember to put your trust in compassion. The experiences of practitioners whose stories are told here continually describe the reclaiming of compassion and self-love. From this comes a shift of identity, a release from the covering of clay, a return to our original goodness. A divorced veteran of the First Gulf War, Andrew came to meditation to find relief. He had lost his heart in the desert. His patrol came upon a bunker with Iraqi soldiers. They shot and then threw in grenades. Afterward, they found it filled with the bodies of very young men, holding a white flag, unable to signal their surrender. Andrew carried the soul-numbing demand of having to kill at 20 years of age. He also carried the sorrow of his military friends who were still caught in the after effects of the war. Coming to retreat, Andrew didn't know what he wanted, but I felt in him an unexpressed longing for forgiveness, healing, and a reconnection with the world. In the simplest terms, he needed the healing waters of compassion. In the beginning, much of Andrew's training was simply to breathe gently and make room for the waves of his grief. He had feared this opening because he believed that he would be overwhelmed by the tragic memories and the guilt. On retreat, with the support of the meditators around him, he slowly learned to hold his battered body with kindness. Gradually, he extended his heart to the suffering of both the Iraqi people and the American people. When the painful images and guilt arose, he began to experience his innate compassion. The soul force he had felt was lost. This was the start of his return to life. When we lose connection with this tenderness, we may not realize that it can be reawakened so simply and directly. Compassion is only a few breaths away. Rose, a Buddhist practitioner, came to a small group meeting with me on retreat. When it was her turn to talk, she just wanted to sit quietly, settle into herself, be silent. She was naturally shy. It is so much more difficult when I relate to people, Rose said. I know part of this is just my nature, but part of it is the pain of my family history. I can't stand to have anyone's eyes on me. As we talked, she closed her eyes so she would feel safe. Speaking in the group was terrifying. When I inquired into how long she had been this way, it was as early as she could remember. My parents were always watching me, annoyed, scowling, angry, filled with judgment. I have no memories of it ever being another way. As Rose continued to be attentive to her experience, she wept. I asked if she could find any safe place in her body. There was none, she said. Could she remember from her childhood a single instant of well-being? It took her a while. Finally, Rose opened her eyes, rubbed the palm of her right hand, and said, "Crayons." She smiled. She could remember being 5 years old and joyfully holding a box of crayons. I suggested that then she could draw with them. "No, no," she answered. "Anything I draw, they criticize me. I'm only safe when I hold them." The Buddha taught that we can develop loving kindness by visualizing how a caring mother holds her beloved child. I had Rose close her eyes and imagine holding this little girl with the box of crayons. Then I asked, if no one was looking, what would happen next? With her eyes still closed, her face lit up, she threw out her arms and she said, "I'd hold them and dance, like a fairy princess. That's what I always wanted to be." When the group was over, I went to the market and bought her a box of crayons. That day Rose went out into the woods and danced. Then she colored a picture, the first she had drawn since childhood. She showed it to me. When she went back to meditate, her heart was filled with joy, her mind was open, well-being filled her 64-year-old body. Compassion for our own fear and shame opens us to others. After Rose had learned to color pictures and to practice compassion for herself, she began to include all the suffering girls like herself, near and far, who have been betrayed, lost, isolated. She could feel them as her sisters, and she knew that she was not alone. Now it was not just Rose's pain, she had the sorrows of the woman and of the world in her heart. Compassion is courage. As children, many of us were taught courage in the form of the warrior or the explorer, bravely facing danger. In the Buddhist understanding, however, great courage is not demonstrated by aggression or ambition. Aggression and ambition are more often expressions of fear and delusion. The courageous heart is the one that is unafraid to open to the world. With compassion, we come to trust our capacity to open to life without armoring. As the poet Rilke reminds us, ultimately, it is on our vulnerability that we depend. This is not a poetic ideal but a living reality, demonstrated by our most beloved sages. Mahatma Gandhi had the courage to be jailed and beaten, to persevere through difficulties without giving in to bitterness and despair. His vulnerability became his strength. We need the same courage to pass through a difficult divorce without lashing out and increasing the pain and anguish. We need it when our children are in trouble, when things go wrong at work. In all these situations, we are vulnerable and everyone involved needs compassion. Buddhist teachings often speak of compassion for all beings, but for most of us, compassion is developed one person and one difficult situation at a time. Novelist Ann Patchett, writing during the First Gulf War, put it this way: "When it gets down to one life, the mind achieves a vivid understanding. If I take the deaths in one at a time, I notice that Marine Lance Corporal Michael E. Linderman, Jr. of Douglas, Oregon, was only 19, and I know what it was like to be 19. And I noticed that there wasn't a standard military portrait taken of Marine Private First Class Dion J. Stephenson of Bountiful, Utah, and so they used his prom picture, and you can see the hook on the strap of his bow tie. After you look at these pictures, the war becomes difficult to follow, because to be decent, we have to stop and love them and mourn their passing. And there are getting to be so many of them, it's impossible not to fall behind. Martin Luther King Jr. exhorted us: never succumb to the temptation of becoming bitter. As you press for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the instruments of love. At the worst times, such an attitude may seem impossible. Yet even though some of King's followers later rejected his precepts of non-violence, something in us knows that closing down is not the way. Yes, the world is full of pain, uncertainty, and injustice. But in this vulnerable human life, every loss is an opportunity either to shut out the world or to stand up with dignity and let the heart respond. Israeli businessman Yitzhak Frankenthal faced this choice when his son was murdered by Palestinian gunmen. Only days later, Frankenthal stood before the Israeli Prime Minister's residence and said, "I am unwilling to delegate my ethics to soldiers and politicians. If the security forces were to strike back now and kill innocent Palestinians in retaliation, I would tell them they were no better than my son's killers. Even if they found that his killer was planning another murderous attack, if he were surrounded by innocent children and civilians, I would say no. Do not seek revenge. Do all you can to avoid and prevent the violence, the death of all Israelis or Palestinians. But do not kill. In my son's name, please listen." He went on to found the Arik Institute, named for his son, which works for reconciliation and peace. Living with compassion does not mean we have to give away all our possessions, take in every homeless person we meet, and fix every difficulty in our extended family and community. Compassion is not codependence. It does not mean we lose our self-respect or sacrifice ourselves blindly for others. In the West, we are confused about this point. We mistakenly fear that if we become too compassionate, we will be overwhelmed by the suffering of others. But this happens only when our compassion is one-sided. In Buddhist psychology, compassion is a circle that encompasses all beings, including ourselves. Compassion blossoms only when we remember ourselves and others, when the two sides are in harmony. Compassion is not foolish. It doesn't just go along with what others want so they don't feel bad. There is a yes in compassion, and there is also a no, said with the same courage of the heart. Not to abuse, no to abuse, no to racism, no to violence, both personal and worldwide. The no is said not out of hate, but out of an unwavering care. Buddhists call this the fierce sword of compassion. It is the powerful no of leaving a destructive family, the agonizing no of allowing an addict to experience the consequences of his acts. Wherever it is practiced, compassion brings us back to life. When a woman named Lavon came to Buddhist practice 3 years after her husband's death, she was angry and depressed. She had closed herself off from the world as if her loss were an unforgivable betrayal. She lived alone, out of contact with old friends and her sisters and their children, and she had abandoned the political work that once inspired her life. Life felt cold, unforgiving, meaningless. Her body grew stiff. She knew she needed help. Over the 2 months of her meditation retreat, with 1,000 soft breaths, she began to release the pains of her grieving body. She practiced loving kindness and compassion for herself. Then her compassion grew to include all those who, like her, had lost their most beloved family members. Lavon's heart began to ease. One morning she came to see me and pulled out of her pocket an egg, a hard-boiled egg she had kept from breakfast 2 days before. She said it was her heart, round and smooth and warm, and she kept it in her hand all day as she walked and said, It was her way of holding herself, of bringing the living warmth back to her own grieving heart. Now she said, I am ready to go back and love the world again. Practice. A meditation on compassion. To cultivate compassion, let yourself sit in a centered and quiet way. In this traditional form of practice, you will combine a repeated inner intention with visualization and the evocation of the feeling of compassion. As you first sit, breathe softly and feel your body, your heartbeat, the life within you. Feel how you treasure your own life, how you guard yourself in the face of your sorrows. After some time, bring to mind someone close to you whom you dearly love. Picture them and feel your natural caring for them. Notice how you hold them in your heart. Then let yourself be aware of their measure of sorrows, their suffering in life. Feel how your heart opens to wish them well, to extend comfort, to share in their pain and meet it with compassion. This is the natural response of the heart. Inwardly recite these phrases. May you be held in compassion. May your pain and sorrow be eased. May you be at peace. Continue reciting all the while you are holding the person in your heart. You can modify these phrases in any way that makes them true to your heart's intention. After a few minutes, turn your compassion toward yourself and the measure of sorrows you carry. Recite the same phrases. May I be held in compassion. May my pain and sorrow be eased. May I be at peace. After a time, begin to extend compassion to others you know. Picture loved ones, one after another. Hold the image of each in your heart. Be aware of the person's difficulties and wish him or her well with the same phrases. Then you can open your compassion further, a step at a time, to the suffering of your friends, to your neighbors, to your community, to all who suffer, to difficult people, to your enemies, and finally to the brotherhood and sisterhood of all beings. Sense your tender-hearted connection with all life and its creatures. Work with compassion practiced intuitively. At times it may feel difficult, as though you might be overwhelmed by the pain. Remember, you are not trying to fix the pain of the world, only to hold it with a compassionate heart. As you practice again and again, relax and be gentle. Breathe. Let your breath and heart rest naturally as a center of compassion in the midst of the world. This concludes the reading of the day. Goodbye.